But yeah, I'm just kind of really happy to be here. I've never been able to do a tour in my life, and being able to visit libraries virtually has been a really great thing. But libraries used to be my favorite thing when I was a kid. I grew up in Malaysia, and due to import costs and things like that, like your average paperback would cost like $60. I didn't grow up close to a
Okay.
library. I lived in the suburbs of Malaysia, in a really interesting neighborhood, honestly. The house where I grew up in was kind of spooky. Um, there were 7 suicides while I was living there, and it would all involve people hanging themselves on the tree in front of my house. Very popular tree. To this day, I wonder why nobody cut that tree down. That thing was just hanging there. No pun intended. But I think in a weird way, that's where my affection for haunted houses came up. So I don't know if it's true or not. And as the decades go, our memories start to dim a little. They start to merge with our understandings of it, the way we've told stories about them. But as far as I recall, there were a few unusual things. One of which was, so right above my dining room, there was like a beam across the ceiling. And for years, whenever we were sitting at a dining table, we would hear this sound, this thumping noise, just almost like someone banging against the vertical beam. And I recall my father going, just ignore it, it's the pipes. And then on a separate occasion, he would go, no, those are just rats. And I'm like, well, that's a concern, but all right. And then when I was 15, I was cramming for an exam. And I'd been awake for about 2 days straight. So I was a little bit hysterical at this point and just kind of twitching in place. And so the knocking, it was 3 a.m. And the knocking began. It was just like, tom, tom, tom. And as the minutes passed, it got progressively louder. It got progressively more aggressive. And I remember thinking very distinctly to myself, oh my God, my parents are going to wake up. I'm going to get into trouble. I really need to study, or I'm going to fail the history exam. And completely exasperated, I kind of looked up at the ceiling and went, could you please just stop? I'm trying to study here. Instantly stopped. I recall looking up at the ceiling, blinking very slowly, going, nope, I am done. And just kind of running upstairs and hiding for the rest of the night. The next day, it started again when my sister was in the dining room. And loud pounding. And I sort of jokingly told her, just ask it politely to stop. It always does. And she did. And the thing stopped. And we lived there for another 5, 6 years until I was well into my teens and going to college. And every time the noise started, that was the same thing. It would just, sound would stop whenever you asked politely. Like I said, I am not sure if it was circumstance, if I'm misremembering it, but that's one of my clearest memories of weird things happening in that house. I always envy the kids in movies who got to celebrate Halloween. Trick or treating was the coolest thing ever. And everyone was like, oh, it's only make believe. It wasn't until I was about 20 or so that I realized it was a real tradition that I'd been robbed of. And I was very cross about the whole thing. But what we did celebrate, which is, I guess, on par in terms of being interesting, although I think the traditions back home were a lot creepier, was the Hungry Ghost Festival. It was believed that every August, the gates of hell is open and all of the dead come back, and they're allowed a single month. Just kind of roam around, see the other sites, partake in offerings, maybe check on your families. And some people believed as well, it was the one month a year when the ghosts were allowed to steal a soul to replace them in hell. If they could catch somebody and drag them back, they would be allowed to continue with the reincarnation cycle. So that was incredibly spooky. But one of the things that was really cool about the Hungry Ghost Festival was we had what we called get-dies. And these were just enormous stages erected in all the neighborhoods. There would be people, burlesque dancers, there would be singers, comedians, the whole bit. Like, it's just a variety show coming onto the stage, performing. And the first row of seats were always empty. They were very often red, and no one would sit on them. Obviously, these are for the ghosts. And people mill around, check out what's going on, continue with their lives. But as time progressed, the living would start moving away, but the performance would keep performing. And the performances would last all the way till like 3, 4 a.m. Because ultimately the get-dies weren't intended for the living. They were established to amuse the dead. I know Halloween is just kind of lovely. It's a perfect time. There's a little bit of spookiness and a lot of fall, and I kind of love all the autumn bits. I still haven't tried a pumpkin spice latte, and I don't know if it's quite worth it. The Hunger Ghost Festival is something I haven't really had a chance to write about, but I'm hoping one day to like do a full book about Asian mythology, particularly Southeast Asian mythology, which is, I think, a little bit more bloodthirsty than some of the others within the region. But Mongrels is a book that I reread constantly, and I do it a lot more during the autumn. For those who don't know what it is a werewolf book by Stephen Graham Jones, and you have this working class family that also happens to be a group of werewolves, except one. The narrator is a young kid who desperately wants to be a werewolf, but can't quite develop his claws just yet, but he's really hoping that it will happen. And it is this beautiful story about trying to survive in America, about growing up, about wanting, and also just about the coolest werewolves I have ever read about. And Stephen Graham Jones does this thing with this book, where it's both funny in parts, but also genuinely harrowing. The excerpt that I keep bringing up whenever I talk about a book involves him explaining why werewolves should not wear fishnets. And he opens with the line, and you're like, that's funny. Ha ha ha. Let me picture a werewolf wearing stockings. But then he goes in depth. He talks about what happens to the fibers, how it might go into the body when a wolf transforms and transforms back, how it might tauten, how it might cut through organs, and how it might leave a wolf with its intestinal tract just ripped up by string, and how it might just gnaw through itself trying to get to it. And you finish that paragraph just leaning back, like, oh dear God. And he keeps doing that throughout the book. And it's also a book with just the most beautiful turns of phrases. Now, being a horror writer, I tend to be really attracted to the macabre. And so my idea of beauty might not be the same as everyone else's, but there's a line in the book talking about a corpse. And it talked about how the vultures had unstrung the body's guts across an entire highway. And I remember just reading that, the economy of the phrase, the beauty of the language. And God damn it, I wish I wrote that first. I absolutely rewatched the Pink Brothers' The Eye every spooky season. I hate the remake with all of my heart and soul. But The Eye remains one of my favorite horror movies of all time. Um, so I work in video games for my day job, and very often video games tend to be kind of loud and in your face. But I remember Alien Isolation making it a lot more subtle. Things happening in the background, this, that, and the other. And one of the most terrifying moments for me in any video game was the first time you're introduced to the alien and you're kind of walking towards a desk and you sort of go under it, I think. And what you see from a chute above the ceiling is just this tail coming down, slithering around, and going back up. And then you hear things moving in the walls and in their ceiling, and you're like, oh God, this is going to be so bad. I do write at night to set the mood for myself, but eventually I get so twitchy, I have to migrate from my desk to my bed and just stack pillows safely around myself and continue doing it because I am so tense. Um, but I've never scared myself. I've just left myself twitching in shadows, if that makes sense. Although there is one book in the world that successfully jump scared me, and I'm both impressed and appalled that that happened. Um, T. Kingfish's The Twisted Ones, in fact. I remember reading it and just getting so immersed in the book that when the reveal happened, I chucked my Kindle at the wall and just started swearing at myself and the book and the fact that I chucked my Kindle at the wall. Book has been a really, really difficult one for me to promote because I wrote that during a very bad part of my life. The year before I started writing it, I found out my dad died of a heart. And I was all the way in Portland. I was supposed to do an event in London in 4 days. And when I found out, I was like, I'm going to cancel my plans. I'm going home. Because that's what you do when you find out your father has died suddenly.
Right.
And I remember my mother telling me, "Oh no, don't bother. We're scattering his ashes today." And it just got to me that I didn't even get a ritualized goodbye, that they would do that to me when I'm his eldest child. So for the year after that, standard grief procedure, ups and downs, getting over it. Almost exactly a year later, I found that he actually killed himself in a very sudden way. So I ended up writing Nothing But Blackened Teeth kind of around then, talking about hauntings, about being haunted, about being trapped in your own head. And the book started fleshing itself out a little more because I found that during that time, it I was kind of almost too grateful to the few people who would still tolerate me in my grief, because what I found out is, even though no one says it, there is that tacit sense that grief shouldn't last too long. You're allocated like a year or so, and after that people start looking at you funny and they're like, haven't you gotten over this? Like, life needs to continue. And modern society being what it is, with our glorification of youth and all that, people just get uncomfortable with, talking about death and grief. And so those people I could rely on, a lot of them were still really, really kind people who went above and beyond in supporting me. But there were a few, I think, to put it gently, who took advantage of that. And I ended up writing a lot about toxic relationships, about how some friendships, some romantic links, we cling on to them far longer than we should. We hang on to relationships because we're told there is only one possible conclusion for any of them. they need to last until we die. Anything else, you're kind of wrong. Like you're doing it poorly. You're not being a good human.
Right.
And so, because we're taught all of that, we often find ourselves letting that poison seep into us because we try to tell ourselves, no, this is my friend, no, this is my husband, my wife, my boyfriend, my girlfriend, my whatever. We
Right.
do love them. We loved them in the beginning, didn't we? Then we lie and we lie and we lie to ourselves. We gaslight ourselves until we're choking on the pain that all it creates. So all of that went into the book. And because of that, when people ask, what am I most excited about sharing? I'm like, I don't know. It is a very traumatic moment in my life that I kind of got over by writing aggressively. Yes, very much so. It felt cathartic. It felt like almost being in conversation with myself and being in conversation with the things that my therapist told me, with what I learned during that time, with what people explained. My realization about toxic relationships and all that didn't really happen until I really got deep into the book. Um, I hesitated because that was very private and personal and deeply, painfully raw for me. But at the same time, there's this comic who's I don't know the name of the creator and I wish I could remember. It's about two goblins. One of these goblins is like making cool, fun, like entertainment park stuff. And another goblin is just creating horrific engines of depression. I don't know, like siege engines, spike balls tied to a balloon that he would drop down a ravine. And the nice happy goblin goes up to him and goes, so why are you making these horrible things? Who the hell wants them? And the grumpy goblin just glares at his counterpart and sort of drops off another balloon into the darkness. And the next few panels, you see that balloon descending, 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 descending. And eventually you see a hand coming out from this mountain of bark and clinging to it. And I kind of hope this book will be that for some people. I am not arrogant enough to say that is the best book to inspire or create empathy and so on, but I hope that book makes someone out there feel like they're not alone, that navigating after grief, that being stuck in toxic relationships is not an experience unique to themselves, and that people who have been in the same places um, can get out. So I really am excited for people to see is I do a horror movie has certain tropes in regards to who dies. Without spoiling anything, I hope people are amused by my decisions. What most authors don't get any opportunity to make input on the covers, in fact. But Nightfire was like, "Do you have any dream artists for this?" And I basically just screamed Samuel Arias' name in like 6 emails. Oh God, if we could get Sam Araya, this would be the best possible thing. Um, God, and like when I got the cover, I was just utterly stunned. It was above and beyond anything that I could have asked for. It was like the most beautiful thing. Um, I also wish I was less of a scaredy cat in real life because I desperately want a print of it in my home. But I also know if I see her in my hallway at 3 a.m. in the morning, I'm going to fall off something screaming in terror. Trickle off to another event that is happening in like 15 minutes.